Picture this. It's a warm summer day in 1928, and you're watching your children play in the neighborhood. An elderly man walks by, gray hair, gentle smile. Maybe he even tips his hat and asks about the weather. He looks like someone's grandfather, the kind of person you'd trust to help your child if they were lost. Now imagine discovering that this same man is one of the most depraved serial killers in American history. I'm talking about Albert Fish, a name that still makes seasoned detectives shudder almost a century later. Today, we're going to dive deep into a story that's not just about one man's horrific crimes, but about how evil can hide behind the most innocent facade. This is about the families torn apart, the investigators who never gave up, and the chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Fair warning, this story is going to get dark. But understanding cases like this helps us protect the people we love. So let's uncover the truth about the man they called the Brooklyn Vampire. For over 2 decades, Albert Fish walked among us. He painted houses, attended church, played with neighborhood children. Parents welcomed him into their homes. Kids ran to greet him on the street. But behind those kind, grandfatherly eyes lurked something so twisted that even today, criminal psychologists struggle to fully understand it. We're going to follow his entire journey, from a traumatized child to America's most notorious predator. And I'll show you exactly how he got away with it for so long. Let me tell you about Hamilton Howard Fish. That was Albert's real name, and how a little boy's nightmare became everyone else's. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Albert never really had a chance. His family was what we'd politely call troubled today. But back then, mental illness was barely understood, let alone treated. His father was in his 70s when Albert was born. Imagine that age gap. And the Fish family tree was riddled with relatives who'd spent time in mental institutions. When Albert was just 5 years old, his world collapsed. His elderly father died, and his mother, overwhelmed and unable to cope, made a decision that would haunt countless families decades later. She sent little Albert to St. John's Orphanage. Now, I need you to understand something about orphanages in the 1870s. They weren't the caring institutions we might imagine today. St. John's was a place where unwanted children were basically warehoused. And the staff, well, let's just say background checks weren't a thing back then. Albert later described his time there as a living hell. But here's the truly chilling part. He began to enjoy it. The beatings, the humiliation, the pain. Somehow, his young brain started associating all of this with pleasure. Child psychologists today would recognize this as a trauma response, but Albert's developing mind twisted it into something far more dangerous. He didn't just endure the abuse, he began participating in it. He'd watch other children being tortured and eventually joined in. By age 7, when his mother finally came back for him, Albert had learned that inflicting pain gave him power, and receiving it gave him satisfaction. Think about that for a moment. A 7-year-old child, already conditioned to find pleasure in violence. His mother thought she was rescuing him, but she was actually bringing home a ticking time bomb. Here's what makes Albert Fish's story so terrifying. For most of his adult life, he seemed completely normal. Better than normal, actually. Neighbors loved him. In 1898, he married Anna Mary Hoffman, and they had 6 children together. Albert worked as a house painter, showed up on time, did good work, never caused trouble. On Sundays, you'd find him in church with his family. During the week, he'd help neighbors with odd jobs. Kids in the neighborhood would run up to him on the street because he always had candy in his pockets and stories to tell. But even then, there were signs. Anna began to notice her husband's unusual interests. He'd disappear for days without explanation. She'd find strange implements hidden around the house. His behavior in private became increasingly disturbing. But this was the early 1900s. Women didn't have many options when their husbands exhibited strange behavior. Albert had also developed what he called his instruments of hell, needles that he would insert into his own body for pleasure. Doctors who later examined him found 29 needles embedded in his pelvis alone. Some had been there so long that his body had grown around them. The breaking point came in 1917. Anna had finally seen enough of her husband's bizarre practices and violent fantasies. She took their children and left him. For Albert, this abandonment triggered something catastrophic. The thin veneer of normalcy that marriage and family life had provided was stripped away. Without Anna and the children to anchor him to a conventional life, Albert's darker impulses began to surface more frequently. He started traveling more for work, but these weren't just painting jobs anymore. He was scouting, learning, preparing. The scariest part, nobody noticed the change. To everyone else, Albert was just a sad, lonely old man whose wife had left him. People felt sorry for him. They invited him for dinner. They trusted him with their children. By the 1920s, Albert Fish had perfected his hunting technique, and it was absolutely chilling in its simplicity. He didn't lurk in dark alleys or snatch children off playgrounds. Instead, he used society's own kindness against itself. Albert would scan newspaper-classified ads looking for families seeking employment or offering work. When he found a suitable target, he'd show up at their door dressed impeccably. Clean suit, polished shoes, speaking in that soft, grandfatherly voice that immediately put people at ease. He'd introduce himself with a fake name, usually Frank Howard, and spin elaborate stories about his successful farm or business. But here's the truly calculated part. Albert wasn't just improvising these stories. He'd research his targets beforehand, learning about their financial struggles, their hopes for their children's future. He knew exactly what desperate families wanted to hear, and he gave it to them in spades. Families would invite this charming old gentleman into their homes, serve him dinner, introduce him to their children. Parents would see their kids laughing and playing with Mr. Howard and think, "What a kind man. Our children are safe with him." Albert later confessed to crimes across 23 states. Think about that geographical scope. This wasn't some disorganized killer striking randomly in his neighborhood. This was a methodical predator who traveled the country like a traveling salesman, except his product was death. He claimed to have killed over 400 people, though investigators could only confirm a fraction of that number. But even if the real count was just 15 or 20, that's still 15 or 20 families destroyed by a man they welcomed into their homes. What made Albert particularly dangerous was his patience. He'd sometimes visit families multiple times, building trust, becoming almost like a family friend before making his move. Parents would actually look forward to his visits. Children would ask when the nice man was coming back. And Albert's method of selecting victims was coldly strategic. He targeted poor families, knowing that when their children disappeared, the investigations might not be as thorough as they would be for wealthier families. He preyed on people who were already struggling, who were desperate enough to trust a stranger offering hope. Let me tell you about the case that would finally bring Albert Fish to justice, because it shows you exactly how his predatory system worked, and how close he came to never being caught. It was May 1928 when 18-year-old Edward Budd placed a classified ad in the New York World newspaper. Edward was trying to find work to help support his family during tough economic times. It was an innocent ad, the kind placed by thousands of young people looking for honest work. Albert Fish saw that ad and recognized an opportunity. A few days later, a well-dressed elderly gentleman knocked on the Budd family's door in Manhattan. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, claiming to be a wealthy farmer from Long Island who needed help on his property. The Budds were immediately charmed by this soft-spoken man who promised Edward steady work at good wages. But Albert wasn't really there for Edward. During his visit, he met Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace, a beautiful, trusting child who represented everything Albert had been hunting for. Over the next week, Albert visited the Budd family multiple times. He brought gifts, told stories, played with the children. The family came to see him almost as a grandfather figure. Mrs. Budd would prepare special meals when Mr. Howard came to visit. Grace would run to greet him at the door. Then came June 3rd, 1928, a date that would haunt the Budd family forever. Albert arrived with a story about attending his niece's birthday party in Westchester County. Would little Grace like to come along? There would be other children there, games, cake. It would be such fun for her. Put yourself in the Budds' shoes for a moment. This was a man they'd welcomed into their home multiple times. He'd been nothing but kind and generous. Grace was excited about the party, and it seemed like a wonderful opportunity for her to have some fun. Mrs. Budd dressed Grace in her best white dress and pink sash. She packed a small bag with Grace's favorite things. The whole family waved goodbye as the kind old man and their precious daughter walked down the street together, Grace skipping excitedly beside him. It was the last time they ever saw her alive. Instead of a birthday party, Albert took Grace to an abandoned house he'd prepared in advance. What happened there was so horrific that I won't describe it in detail, but Grace's final hours were filled with unimaginable terror and pain. For 6 agonizing years, the Budd family lived in limbo. Grace had simply vanished. Despite extensive police investigations and nationwide publicity, no trace of her or Frank Howard could be found. The family clung to hope that maybe, somehow, Grace was still alive somewhere. They had no idea that their daughter's killer was still out there, still hunting, still wearing that same grandfatherly mask that had fooled them so completely. 6 years passed. 6 years of the Budd family wondering, hoping, praying for answers about their daughter Grace. Then, in November 1934, something arrived in their mailbox that would answer their questions in the most horrific way possible. It was an unsigned letter addressed to Mrs. Delia Budd, and it was written by Albert Fish himself. But this wasn't a confession driven by guilt or remorse. It was something far more twisted. Albert had written this letter because he wanted to relive his crime, and he wanted Grace's mother to suffer even more than she already had. The letter described in graphic detail what Albert had done to Grace. He wrote about her final moments with a casual tone that was somehow even more disturbing than the content itself. He claimed that Grace hadn't cried during her ordeal and described acts of cannibalism that were so shocking, even hardened police officers couldn't read the entire letter without feeling sick. But here's the thing about evil. It often contains the seeds of its own destruction. Albert's compulsion to torment Grace's family was exactly what investigators needed to finally catch him. Detective William King had never given up on the Grace Budd case. When that letter arrived, he immediately recognized it as genuine. It contained details that only Grace's killer could have known. More importantly, it gave him his first real lead in 6 years. The envelope bore a small but crucial clue: the emblem of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. King began the painstaking process of tracking down every person who had access to that particular stationery. The investigation led to a rooming house where Albert had been staying. The landlady remembered the quiet old man who'd left behind an unclaimed paycheck. She'd kept it, thinking he might return for it someday. King staked out that rooming house for weeks, waiting. And finally, on December 13, 1934, Albert Fish walked through the front door to collect his money. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. The frail, elderly man offered no resistance as Detective King placed him in handcuffs. But when King looked into Albert's eyes, he later said he felt like he was staring into an abyss. There was something fundamentally absent there, something that should have been human but simply wasn't. Fish's trial began March 11, 1935, becoming a media sensation. His defense claimed insanity, but prosecutors argued his decades of successful evasion proved cunning and awareness. Fish seemed to enjoy the attention, providing detailed confessions with chilling, matter-of-fact delivery. The jury deliberated just 4 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Fish received the death sentence and was executed at Sing Sing Prison on January 16, 1936, reportedly appearing eager for what he viewed as the ultimate pain. Albert Fish's story reminds us that evil often disguises itself as kindness. Sometimes it wears a grandfather's face and speaks in gentle tones. Trust your instincts. The safety of loved ones sometimes depends on our willingness to be suspicious of those who seem too good to be true. The families carried permanent scars, but their courage-seeking justice ensured this monster could never harm another child. Sometimes that's all we can do. Remember, learn, and protect each other from the darkness walking among us.